I arrived at my daughter's house for Thanksgiving without an invitation, thinking it was just a misunderstanding. But as I stood on the porch with a pumpkin pie in my hands, I heard voices and laughter from behind the closed door, and I realized that someone else had already taken my place at the family table. Thanksgiving morning started strangely for me. Instead of the usual call with warm wishes and an invitation to the festive table, I received a short, terse message from Emily. "Mom, it's better if you don't come. We have other plans." I reread it 3 times, thinking it must be a mistake. Other plans? Isn't Thanksgiving a family holiday? Hadn't we celebrated it together every single year since she was a little girl in a turkey-themed apron? I tried calling, but the call was declined. I wrote, "Are you okay?" and received only silence in return. 10 minutes later, with my lips pressed together, I put the pie in the oven. The same pie my grandchildren always looked forward to, with its tender butternut squash filling, warm cinnamon, and a pinch of ginger. I decided not to take the message seriously. She must be stressed, busy in the kitchen. Maybe she and Brandon had a fight, and she lashed out. Everything would be fine once I showed up at their doorstep. When the pie had cooled, I carefully placed it in a box, tied it with a ribbon, and put on my best warm sweater. Outside, a cold November wind was blowing, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the neighbors' fireplaces. The drive to Emily's house took 20 minutes. The closer I got, the faster my heart beat. Not from fear, but from a strange premonition. I climbed the familiar wooden steps of their porch, carefully so as not to damage the pie. I knocked on the door, once, then again. Silence. But then from inside, I heard sounds, loud laughter, the clinking of glasses, the clatter of plates, and a child's squeal. But they weren't the voices of my grandchildren. I pressed my ear against the door. A woman's voice, unfamiliar and bright, said, "Brandon, this sauce is a masterpiece." And he replied, "Thanks, Sarah. This holiday wouldn't be the same without you." Sarah? I ran through the names of all our family friends. There was no one named Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. I suddenly understood with perfect clarity that at the table where my monogrammed plate had sat for years, someone else was now sitting. That my pie, which had always been a part of this day, was now unwanted. A feeling settled in my chest, as if someone had slowly closed a door, not just to the house, but to my life. The morning of Thanksgiving started strangely for me. Instead of the usual call with good wishes and an invitation to the festive table, I received a short, dry message from Emily. "Mom, it's better if you don't come. We have other plans." I read it 3 times. Other plans? For our family, this day had always been sacred. Since Emily was a little girl, we had always cooked together. She would knead the pie dough, and I would teach her that the real holiday wasn't about the turkey, but about us sitting together. I tried to call. The call was declined. I wrote, "Are you okay?" The response was silence. An unpleasant feeling began to grow in my chest, but I pushed it away. I decided it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she was in a hurry, or just tired. I put the pie in the oven, the same one the grandchildren always looked forward to. The smell of nutmeg and cinnamon filled the kitchen, and I remembered how a couple of years ago they, covered in flour, would run around the table shouting, "Hurry, Grandma! We're hungry!" When the pie was cool, I carefully placed it in a box, tied it with a golden ribbon, and put on my warm burgundy sweater and coat. Outside, a cold November wind was blowing, and the scent of smoke was already wafting from the neighbors' chimneys. The drive to Emily's house took 20 minutes. I kept telling myself, she's just tired. She'll be happy to see me. I went up the wooden steps of the porch, holding the box carefully. I knocked once, then again. Silence. But in that same second, sounds burst through the door: laughter, the clinking of glasses, the clatter of plates, a child's squeal. But they weren't the voices of my grandchildren. I pressed my ear to the door. "Brandon, this sauce is a masterpiece!" A woman's voice, bright and unfamiliar, rang out. "Thanks, Sarah, this holiday wouldn't be so warm without you," my son-in-law replied. "Sarah?" I ran through the names of all our family friends. There was no one with that name. My heart began to pound harder. I suddenly understood with perfect clarity. At the table where my monogrammed plate had sat for years, someone else was now sitting. My pie, which had always been a part of this day, was now unwanted. The feeling in my chest was as if the door I had been trying to open had been slowly but decisively closed, not just to the house, but to my life. After Michael's death, the house where we had lived for 32 years began to feel too big and achingly empty. Every room was saturated with his presence. His favorite armchair by the window, his shirts neatly hung in the closet, even the smell of his aftershave that seemed to have soaked into the walls. I would find myself listening to the silence, as if he would soon come home from work and say, "Meg, what's for dinner?" The first few months were like a thick fog. I lived on autopilot, paying bills, watering flowers, going to the grocery store. But every evening I would sit in the empty kitchen and catch myself talking to myself, as if telling him what had happened during the day. That's when I decided it was time to make a change. Emily lived only 20 minutes away, but those 20 minutes always felt like an eternity as the grandchildren grew up, and I saw them less and less. I sold our house, bought a small cottage near her neighborhood, and thought I was starting a new life. I imagined dropping by with a basket of fresh-baked goods, picking the kids up from school so they wouldn't have to go to after-school care. I wanted to be close, to be a part of their everyday lives, and that's how it turned out. In the mornings, I would come over while Emily and Brandon were getting ready for work. I'd pick up the little ones in their pajamas and feed them oatmeal with strawberries. They would laugh when I sang them the same songs I used to sing to their mother. When Emily complained that swimming and gymnastics classes were too expensive, I opened my savings account. "The kids need opportunities," I said, and I transferred the money. I remembered how difficult it was for Michael and me to pay for Emily's piano lessons and didn't want my grandchildren to be in need of anything. And then they had their kitchen remodeled. I saw Emily walking around with a tape measure, planning the cabinets, dreaming of a new set. She said it was a lifelong dream: white fronts, a stone countertop, built-in appliances. She and Brandon counted and recalculated, but the numbers just wouldn't work out. I brought them an envelope with a check inside. "Mom, you don't have to..." Emmy. Ollie started, but I saw her eyes glisten. "I have to," I replied. "It's your home, and it should be exactly how you want it to be." The three of us stood in the tile store, choosing the backsplash pattern. Emily would send me pictures of the renovation progress, and I would text back, "It's so beautiful. I can't wait to see it in person." When the renovation was finished, they invited me for the first dinner in the new kitchen. The children proudly showed me where their stool was so they could help their mom cook, and Brandon, smiling, said, "We would have been saving for a long time without you." I thought to myself then, this is what it's all for. For these smiles, for them to know they can always count on me. I wasn't just helping with money. I had become a part of their daily life. I would come to take care of the kids when they were sick, and I would stay the night if Emily had to go on a business trip. I brought Brandon soup in a thermos when he was sick with the flu. For holidays, I would bring out my old porcelain, which I had kept since my wedding, and set the table the way I had for decades. I thought all of this was natural, to help, to invest, to be there. I never weighed who owed whom what. I thought we had a strong, warm connection where there was no room for cold calculations. And now, standing at their door on Thanksgiving, I understood. In the years I had spent building bridges, someone had quietly and invisibly dismantled them, one plank at a time. Emily had always been a girl with big plans. Even in school, she already knew she wanted to go to a prestigious university, build a career, and live no worse than anyone else. She had a sharp mind, was organized, and had a determination that impressed her teachers and intimidated her friends. But along with that, there was always something cold about her. She rarely allowed herself to be sentimental. If I said, "I love you," she would reply, "Me too," quickly, as if performing a formality, and would already be moving on to something else. When she introduced me to Brandon, I immediately sensed that he was a practical man. Too practical. His smile never reached his eyes, and his conversations almost always came down to money, profit, or sensible decisions. He was polite, but behind that politeness, something dry and detached was always hiding. In the first years of their marriage, he still tried to make a good impression. He would hold my coat, pour me tea, and ask how I was feeling. But gradually, these gestures of attention faded, and all that remained was a flat, cold courtesy. Sometimes I would catch his gaze, evaluative, as if he were trying to put a price tag on me. Over the years, his attitude became almost transparent. He never directly asked for money, but he knew how to steer a conversation so that I would offer it myself. "These robotics classes for Liam are costing a fortune," he might say at dinner, looking not at me but at his plate, and I would already be getting out my checkbook. The grandchildren, with them, it was different. When they were little, they would run to me shouting, "Grandma," grab my hands and excitedly tell me what happened at school. We would bake cookies, build forts out of blankets, and have evening story times. I kept all their drawings, every crooked house with a sun, and the words, "I love Grandma." But over time, our calls became shorter and shorter. If Liam and Chloe used to grab the phone to tell me their news, now their voices sounded reluctant. More often than not, they would call to ask for something: a new video game console, sneakers, money for a school project. If I tried to talk for a little longer, they would quickly hand the phone to their mother. Once, a couple of months ago, I suggested to Liam that he come over for the weekend so we could go to the zoo together. He hesitated and said, "I'd rather stay home. I have a game." I could hear someone laughing in the background and realized I was no longer part of their plans. Even family evenings had changed. We used to gather in their living room, and I felt at home. But now, when I came over, they seemed to live in their own separate world. Brandon might spend the whole evening on his phone, and Emily would discuss their vacation plans with him, to which I, of course, was not invited. Sometimes I would try to join the conversation, but they would exchange glances, and I would feel awkward, as if I were eavesdropping on someone else's secrets. The small gestures had also changed. Emily stopped kissing me hello. Now it was just a formal air kiss. Brandon stopped calling me Mrs. Hale and started using my first name, dryly and without intonation. I noticed that the gifts I gave the children would quickly disappear. The dress I bought Chloe was worn once. Liam didn't even unwrap the book about space, even though he used to spend hours looking at star charts. Gradually, I realized, for Emily and Brandon, my role had been reduced to being a reliable source of financial help and a free babysitter when needed. Everything else, my opinion, my feelings, my habits, seemed to have become irrelevant. Sometimes I would try to remind myself that they were just busy, that they had a family, jobs, and worries. But all I had to do was remember how they reacted to my attempts to suggest joint trips or holidays, and I saw the same expression on their faces, slight irritation, as if I were disrupting their plans. I stopped feeling like a part of their family. Yes, on Christmas cards, my name was there next to the words, "Loving Mom and Grandma," but behind those words, there was no warmth. And, what was most terrifying, I began to fear that if I stopped helping them financially, even this pretense of politeness would disappear. The evening descended slowly, as if deliberately stretching out every second. The November cold was chilling me to the bone, and the weak light from a street lamp pulled the porch steps out of the darkness. Steps I no longer dared to climb. I stood still, clutching the pie box, feeling how the warmth from it had long since faded, replaced by an icy emptiness in my chest. From inside, I heard the noise, the clinking of dishes, bright laughter, muffled voices. I could make out someone giving a toast and children giggling at some joke. This laughter sounded happy, but it weighed heavily on me. It was foreign. I knew my grandchildren's voices, their timbre, their habits, even the way they laughed. But these voices were different. Children I had never met were laughing in my daughter's house. Their laughter was filling the place where mine once belonged. I listened intently, hoping to hear Emily, and finally caught her voice. Light, carefree, as if this were the happiest evening of her life. She was telling a story, and next to her, a man, my son-in-law, was laughing in response, calling someone sweetheart. And that sweetheart was clearly not meant for my daughter. I recoiled from the door, my heart pounding in my temples. For a second, I wanted to just knock, open the door, and walk in, as I had done hundreds of times before. To say, "Hi, I just dropped by." Put the pie on the table and pretend that nothing had happened. But I knew that wouldn't be the truth. In that moment, it dawned on me. I was a guest in my own family. Not even a guest, but an extra person who had come uninvited and was ruining someone else's holiday. I remembered past years when my arrival on Thanksgiving had been an event, how Emily would text a week beforehand, "Mom, bring your pie, it's not the same without it." How the kids would run out to meet me in their socks, sliding across the floor and clinging to my legs. How we would set the table together, arguing about where to put the candles. And now I was standing on the other side of the door, like a person who had been forgotten or intentionally crossed off the guest list. My gaze fell on the kitchen window on the side of the house. The curtain was slightly ajar, and I saw people sitting at the table. Emily, in a beautiful dress, Brandon, an unfamiliar woman, 2 children I had never met. They were raising their glasses, laughing, and passing dishes to each other, and not a single seat at the table had been left for me. Something clicked inside me. Not a loud, dramatic click, more like a quiet snapping, as if the last thread connecting me to an illusion had just broken. I realized I wasn't the center of the family for them, not the person they gathered around, but a convenient figure they could summon when needed. I was needed when they had problems, when they needed help with the kids, when they were short on money. But in moments of joy, of celebration, of intimacy, there was no place for me, and this realization was colder than any November wind. I stood there for a few more seconds, hoping someone would come to the door, accidentally see me, and something would change. But it didn't happen. I quietly went down the steps and slowly walked to my car. With every second, my heart grew heavier. But with it, a strange feeling was born. It wasn't like resentment. It was a firmness, a resolve. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. Inside, there was a complete silence in which I could clearly hear only my own thoughts. Enough. I will no longer stand at other people's doors, waiting to be let in. I will no longer allow them to decide if I am needed in their lives. I arrived home, placed the cold pie on the kitchen table, and took off my coat. I suddenly realized that this pie, which I had baked with love, was a symbol of everything I had done for them all these years: care, help, warmth. And just as it now remained untouched, so too did I remain unneeded. That night I stayed up for a long time. I sat in an armchair with a cup of tea and mentally replayed the moments when I had closed my eyes to their coldness, when I had convinced myself they were just tired, just busy, when I had justified being pushed further and further to the periphery of their lives. Now I knew this wasn't an accident. It was a system, and I would no longer be a pawn in it. I drove home slowly, as if I were afraid that a sharp turn or sudden acceleration would shatter the fragile cocoon of thoughts I had sunk into. The streets were empty. The windows of the houses glowed with a soft yellow light, and in each of them it seemed life was bustling. Families sat at tables, laughing, recalling stories. And I understood. This year, my table was empty. When I opened the door to my house, the silence hit my ears. No footsteps, no voices, no children's laughter, just the gentle ticking of the clock in the living room. I put the cold pie on the kitchen table and suddenly noticed how strange it looked there, like a monument to something that had already died. I took off my coat, hung it in the hallway, and went to the bedroom. In the corner, there was a massive old safe, which I had inherited from Michael. I never opened it unless it was absolutely necessary. Inside were documents that defined my entire future and, as I now understood, the future of those who thought they had a right to manage my life. The key was hidden in a porcelain box on the top shelf of the closet. I took it out and paused for a second. When the cold metal touched my fingers, I felt that I was taking a step from which there would be no turning back. The click of the lock sounded loud in the quiet room. I slowly opened the door. Inside, among neatly arranged folders and envelopes, was my will. The papers I had once signed with the certainty that I was doing the right thing by leaving the house and savings to Emily. I sat down at the writing desk and took out my phone. I dialed the number of my lawyer, Mr. Howard, an old friend of Michael's. He answered almost immediately, and I heard surprise in his voice. He obviously hadn't been expecting calls on Thanksgiving evening. "Meg, is something wrong?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I want to rewrite my will, today." He was silent for a moment, then replied, "Normally these things take time, but if you're sure—" "I'm sure, Howard. More than sure." We agreed to meet at his office in the morning. I hung up the phone and took everything related to the inheritance out of the safe: the house deeds, bank statements, insurance policies. As I went through them, I felt a calm, icy resolve growing in my chest. This house is not just walls and a roof. It's years of my life, my memories, the work of my hands and Michael's, and I will not allow it to go to people who wouldn't even open the door for me on a holiday. I took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write a draft of the new will. There was not a word in it about Emily or Brandon. Instead, I named a foundation I had learned about a couple of years ago, an organization that helps elderly women who have found themselves isolated, women who were abandoned or forgotten by their own families. I remembered the stories I had heard from their coordinator, old Mrs. Hanson, whose son had put her in a nursing home and stopped visiting, Mrs. Davis, who had outlived her husband and daughter, and now her only companion was the television. Their faces flashed through my mind, and I understood. I want my home to become a refuge for someone, not a trophy in the hands of greedy people. Instead of tears, I felt a strange sense of liberation. It was as if a heavy stone I had been carrying on my heart had begun to crumble. I was no longer the woman who waited to be invited, to be acknowledged as needed. I was the one who chose who was worthy of my care and my legacy. I carefully folded the old will, put it in an envelope, and signed it. Invalid. I placed it in a separate folder. Let it remain as a reminder that I once believed in people who didn't deserve it. The clock in the living room struck 9 o'clock. It was quiet outside, and a thin layer of snow had begun to settle on the porch. I closed the safe, turned the key twice, and put it back in its place. And for the first time in many months, I felt that I was in control of the situation. This wasn't an impulsive decision, not a fit of anger. It was a carefully calculated step, the first in a chain of actions that were meant to put everything in its place once and for all. I brewed myself some tea, returned to the living room, and sat in the armchair. The draft of the new will was on the coffee table in front of me. I looked at it and thought, this is it. My answer, calm, cold, irrefutable. That night, I went to bed without the usual feelings of resentment or disappointment. In their place had come something far more valuable, a sense of inner strength. Exactly 1 week had passed since that evening when I stood at her door and heard foreign voices at the holiday table. 7 days of silence. Not a call, not a message, not even a perfunctory, "How are you?" as if that Thanksgiving hadn't happened at all. I had managed to meet with Mr. Howard, sign the new will, and formalize the transfer of the house to the foundation. The notary stamped the document, and in that moment, I felt the last thread that tied me to Emily in the Old Way snap. And then, on a Saturday morning, as I was leisurely drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, the phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a few seconds, as if it were a stranger's name, deciding whether to answer or not. I picked up the phone. "Mom." Her voice was hoarse, trembling. "We need to talk. This is important." I was silent, waiting for her to continue. "I just found out." She paused, as if steeling herself. "That you changed the will. Brandon spoke to our lawyer, and he said the house is no longer in our inheritance. Is that true?" I took a sip of coffee to buy time. "It's true. But—" Panic crept into her voice. "Do you understand that we were counting on that house? That our mortgage directly depends on you leaving it to us? We built our future plans around it." Future plans. It was funny how they always talked about a future that had no place for me. "Emily," I said evenly, "your plans for the future are your plans. My house is my present, and my decision." I heard her exhale sharply, as if trying to hold back tears. "Mom, we're barely making ends meet, as it is. If the bank finds out we don't have the house as collateral, they'll review the terms. They might raise the rates. We could lose our home." I looked out the window, where thin snow was settling on the branches. "It's funny," I said quietly. "You're worried you might lose your house, but you didn't even notice that you had already lost me." A silence hung in the air. She didn't find an immediate answer. Is this revenge for that evening? For us not inviting you to the holiday?" Her voice cracked. "No." I shook my head, even though she couldn't see. "This isn't revenge. This is self-preservation. I'm no longer going to leave my life in the hands of people for whom I only exist when they need something." "But you always said you wanted the house to stay in the family." Her voice was filled with despair mixed with accusation. "Family isn't just a word, Emily. It's not genetics or a shared last name. Family is the people who open their door for you, the people who are happy when you arrive, the ones who consider you a part of their holidays, not an extra seat at the table." She sobbed. "Mom, please, We can fix everything. I know I was wrong, but don't take away our future." I felt a weariness rise in my chest, mixed with pity. But not pity for her, pity for the former me, who for years had clung to any crumb of attention just to not lose the illusion of closeness. "Emily," I said firmly, "the documents are already with the notary. Everything is official. The decision is final." On the other end, silence. The seconds stretched on like an eternity. I could only hear her breathing, broken, like someone fighting back sobs. "So, this is it," she finally said hoarsely. "This is it," I repeated. She hung up first. I put the phone on the table and closed my eyes for a moment. There was no relief, no sense of victory. There was only the realization. This was the end. Not a comma, not a pause, but a period in what I had called family relationships for years. I got up, went to the window, and stared at the quietly falling snow for a long time. A dog was barking somewhere in the distance, and the smell of fresh bread from the next house reminded me that life goes on, with or without Emily. Inside me, there was no longer any fear of being alone, because in that moment, I understood. Loneliness is far more honest than living among people who pretend to love you. A month had passed since that phone call with Emily. She hadn't written or called again. No Merry Christmas, not even a simple "How are you?" For the first time in many years, I celebrated the holiday alone. Without a crowded table, without a frantic kitchen, without other people's demands. I made myself some cocoa, lit candles, and just looked out the window at the gently falling snow. Surprisingly, this loneliness wasn't painful. It was honest. I stopped waiting for a call, stopped hoping that someone would suddenly remember me, stopped putting things off for later, for the family. I understood. Gratitude is not something you can earn if a person only sees you as a resource from the start. Now I was investing my time and money in those who truly appreciated me. I became a volunteer at the foundation to which I had left my house. Every week, I would go there, bring baked goods, help with paperwork, and talk to women who, like me, had once been forgotten or betrayed by their loved ones. And here's the most ironic part. There, among strangers, I felt truly needed for the first time in a long time. Real. One of the women, Mrs. Lang, told me, "You know, Meg, you have a rare gift of being there for someone without asking for anything in return." Those words warmed me more than all the fake thank yous I had heard from my family in recent years. But the world, as I've learned, abhors a vacuum. And when you stop playing by someone else's rules, someone will inevitably try to put you back in your old role. It happened on a cold January evening. I was returning home after a meeting with the foundation when I saw a figure on my porch. It was Emily. She was standing there, wrapped in her coat with red eyes, and in her hands she held the very pie I had once baked for them for the holidays. "Mom," she said the words so quietly, as if she were afraid it would shatter in the frosty air. We lost the house. The bank took it. Brandon left. The kids are living with him, taking turns. I have nowhere to go." I looked at her in silence. A memory flashed before my eyes, me at their door, hearing foreign voices, and not a single one of them calling me to come in. "Can I stay with you?" she asked, and her voice was a mix of hope and desperation. I opened the door and let her in. I gave her a blanket and poured her some tea. She sat on the couch, warming her hands on the mug, and she looked smaller than I remembered. "I understand everything, Mom," she said. "I was wrong, but you won't leave me now, will you?" And this is where, pay attention, I did something that would provoke indignation in some, respect in others, and rage in yet others. I took out my house keys and placed them on the table in front of her. "You can stay for a week, no longer." Her eyes widened. "A week? But you're my mother." "And you're my daughter," I replied calmly. "And yet, you once closed the door on me. Now I'm just giving you time to find a place where someone will open a door for you." She looked at me as if she was trying to figure out if I was joking. But I wasn't. She lived there for a week, quietly, with very few words. And on the 8th day, she packed her things and left. And you know what? I didn't cry. I didn't worry. Because in those months, I had learned the most important lesson. Sometimes, to save yourself, you have to let go of those who chose not to hold on to you. The moral is simple and harsh. No one is obligated to be your family just because of blood. Family is made up of those who open their doors, not those who close them on your darkest day. And yes, if you think I'm too cold, remember that I once stood on a doorstep too, with a pie in my hands.